Hi, I'm Serena. I'm a year 4 medical student at Hong Kong U.
And I'm Zohar. I'm faculty at the Department of Emergency Medicine at HKU.
And today we're going to talk about the Declaration of Helsinki, the background, general principles. There's also a recent amendment that I think you gave a talk about recently.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, and our thoughts on it.
All right, sounds good. And then we're going to focus more on specifically on IRBs or research committees.
Yeah. So do you want to start off with why the declaration was created?
Sure. So why immediately after or even during the Nuremberg Code, the World Medical Association and a bunch of other medical associations in other countries, mostly the French Medical Association, the British Medical Association, initially at least the American Medical Association, realized that they need something more. They need more guidance when it comes to, well, clinical practice, but mostly biomedical research, clinical research. Physicians being what they are, they didn't trust the Nuremberg Code, which was created by jurists, after all. So it wasn't created by physicians, it wasn't created for physicians. It was, from the get-go, it was meant to be a legal document at the request of the Nuremberg of the court in Nuremberg. And it was very rudimentary and frankly superficial. Right? So it had 10 commandments or 10 principles, but it wasn't enough. And as a symbol of that, you could see an example of that is the first principle, which is, informed consent is absolutely necessary, whereas we all know that that's simply not the case. And the authors of the Helsinki Declaration knew that really early on. So this variety of, or a couple of medical associations, so the British, the French, the Dutch, the American, got together with a major push by the British Association and decided, okay, we need to get together and devise this declaration, which will be written by physicians for physicians. And in fact, we see that right now we all remember the Helsinki Declaration, the Nuremberg Code, but we don't really use it, right? What we do use and what IRBs use and what researchers apply for and generally should know is the Helsinki Declaration rather than the Nuremberg Code.
Right. So just a recap, the Nuremberg Code was developed after the Nuremberg trial and was kind of a response to what happened in World War II, the horrible experiments that was done, but it was more of a legal perspective. So a lot of the principles are made very, explicit. It's black and white on paper, and it's not really coming from the perspective of a physician. And this Declaration of Helsinki is kind of a response to that and make it more, medical research focused.
Absolutely, exactly. So the Nuremberg Code was created, or basically the court at Nuremberg didn't have, or it felt that it didn't have the resources, the authority to adjudicate physicians. So it asked 2 American physicians to help him devise this document, this Nuremberg Code, but eventually it was a legal document written by or created by or co-created by physicians, but it wasn't meant for physicians, it was meant for legal purposes. The Helsinki Declaration is for physicians.
Right. And what do you think is the main difference between having a code that's for physician and one that is more legal?
Physicians tend to stick to their own. And, as a medical student, I'm sure you know, that the tendency for physicians or for medical students is to listen, first of all, to other physicians before they listen to non-medical professionals.
So it's just more persuasive.
More persuasive. It has the authority of the medical institution and the global medical institution. So at the time, there were the main medical institutions: French, maybe Dutch, American, British. They were setting the tone.
Right. That's interesting. And what can you tell us about the main principles that was mentioned in the declaration?
So the declaration has had several variations or revisions. So the first one was in '64, and that was still fairly rudimentary. It consisted of, I want to say, 540 words or something like that. So very short, very concise, probably too concise. And still very close to a document, not so much to the Nuremberg Code, but to a document that preceded the Nuremberg Code. It was a draft of basically of the Helsinki Declaration. But we see major development through the different revisions. So one of the most significant revision is exactly in the second revision in '75, requiring the use and the approval of research by IRBs, by institutional review committees. Oh, they have different names, the HICs, but basically it's a research ethics committee. And while it was common, so on a federal level, it was common, or it was expected in the US, for instance. It was expected in some other countries. It wasn't mainstream. And the Helsinki Declaration really made it mainstream. After that, researchers understood and institutions expected from researchers to apply for an IRB, to get approval. So basically, it means that you get the approval of a local, first local, and then maybe a national authority. That was one. What is also very significant is the moving from the patient-physician relationship, right? So only dealing with that kind of research, clinical research, to research involving big data in biobanks. That's another major shift. Two other major shifts are, so the Helsinki Declaration, it started, the origin is about human research in humans.
Right.
With time, or pretty quickly, it moved on to deal with, first of all, worrying about the welfare of animals, and towards this new revision that was just published, taking care of the environment. So now researchers are expected to respect the dignity and autonomy of research participants, humans. Also, they are expected to respect the welfare of animals and consider the welfare of animals, and they should try to minimize the adverse effects that the research have on the environment. And that, I think, pretty significant in a document, again, written by human physicians for human physicians.
That's quite meaningful. I mean, with every revision, we put more into consideration the new advancements in society and the new values that we have grown to have to care about. So there is, big data and technology and all the privacy issues with that. And there's also more attention to not just humans, but animals and environment. And I think that's also part of a more comprehensive ethical responsibility of a physician or any medical professionals.
Yeah,
I think that's a good direction to go.
Yeah. So, and I think you see that reflected in clinical practice nowadays. More and more the literature is talking about green hospitals. And now even hospitals, meaning clinical practice, should also consider, take care, and not ignore the environment or environmental implications of clinical practice. So the wastage of resources, throwing around medications into the sewage system, the risk of antimicrobial resistance because of our use in hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. Another big shift was the focus towards the community.
Right.
And this is something that the Helsinki Declaration actually adopted from other research guidelines, mainly the CIOMS guidelines issued by the World Medical Association. But the recent revision talks about how researchers should provide, first of all, should consider the interests and wishes and needs of local communities, and should be concerned about and take into account the post-research, post-study effects and obligation towards that local community.
That's an interesting point. I really like the green hospital idea. I think I wrote a letter to SCMP before advocating for greener policies and less waste in Hong Kong hospitals. It was actually published.
It was?
Yeah, but it's a very short letter.
Congrats.
Yeah, I think that's an
You
important...
never told me that. Send it to me.
I think I did.
What?
Maybe.
I don't
I'm not
think
sure.
so. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great initiative. I don't think it's talked about enough in the medical sector. And before I wrote that letter, I wasn't aware that that big of a proportion of waste was actually generated from healthcare industry. Especially after COVID, there's a lot of disposable waste and, people just being extra cautious, and, a lot of things can be reused, but they don't do it. And I think, especially in Hong Kong, it's not really a really well discussed topic. And your another point about communities is also great. When do you think it became a bigger focus in the declaration? Was it included in the first draft or only in recent years?
No, it was recent. So we're talking about this revision, or maybe the one before it, so 10 years ago. Okay. That's when we started talking about it. And I think because of various reasons. So basically what is, I think, good, or one of the strengths of the Helsinki Declaration is it's a living document. It keeps evolving. So what happens is when the World Medical Association issues, or was about to issue a declaration, a revision, it calls for public input.
Right.
This revision actually had two public inputs where the public was invited, so lay people or professionals were invited to provide feedback. And it still you can still do it. Even after the revision has been published, you can still do it, actually. And in fact, one of the authors commented on my lecture, and he invited the public to still give feedback. So they are listening. The authors of the declaration are really listening, and they want to get the best result out there. Right. So it's a living document, and are learning from the weaknesses from prior revisions. So that's one point to consider. That's one reason, or one condition that allowed for the improvement of the declaration. The focus on the community is a result, I think, of, basically the mainstream in research ethics. And the focus of bioethicists, meaning both individual bioethicists. So Zeke Emanuel, for instance, who is a famous bioethicist, has two really authoritative and commonly used articles with the title, "What Makes Research Ethical?" Right? So he published one in a major biomedical journal, JAMA, and obviously that got a lot of publication. And then he, with several principles as to what makes research ethical, and then he added two more, and in that addition he talked about community. So that's more about global research, and he talks about the importance of community. So that's one. And again, that became like the movement in research ethics. And then, as I said, the CIOMS guidelines, which is a much more elaborate sort of guidelines issued by a group of researchers and bioethicists, sponsored by the World Medical by the WHO, World Health Organization. They, from the get-go, they emphasize the role of community and the interaction that has to exist between researchers and local communities. And we learn from history. Researchers learned that, and public health experts learned that if you do not involve the community, that increases the risk of you engaging in activity in research that is unethical. And in terms of effectiveness, if you actually want to implement a policy, if you want to implement research, you have to include the community. If not, it's as if you have done nothing.
What do you mean by involving the community? When you talk about global research, what I was thinking of is maybe like a lot of research was done in a third world country, and the community, they were informed, but they're not fully aware of what's happening. So there might be concerns of exploitation in there, or how compensation might be carried out. But what about like local communities? If it's not on an international scale, what kind of community involvement are you talking
Absolutely. So, while Nuremberg, the trial in Nuremberg was taking place, actually one of the authors of the Nuremberg Code was doing research on prisoners in the US, right?
Oh.
And the research that he was doing in the US was not meant to benefit prisoners. It was meant to benefit the citizens of the US who are not in prisons, right? And that was very common during that time, all right? Then there was a movement away from using prisoners and other vulnerable populations, and now there is a return to that. Why? Because we are acknowledging that no, we should include populations, even vulnerable, if the goal is to benefit them. Maybe they want to contribute to society first, and also that research should benefit them. We shouldn't exclude them, because then they will not bear the fruit of research. But what does that mean? That means you should engage in research that, not because it interests you as a researcher, you should engage in research that interests them or should interest them. Meaning, even if they are not aware of the medical issues they might have, you as a researcher, as a medical professional, you're supposed to have a better medical information, scientific data. You should do research that it has the potential to benefit them, right? So you should do research on, the risk of smoking, because that prisoners tend to smoke, right? So you do research, you get money for research, or as a funding body, you give money for research, not because you deem it important, or some researcher in Ivy University thinks it's important, but because it is important for the local community. So what does that mean to include a local community even, not only globally, is to go to the community, engage with the community and community members, community leaders or individuals, and first you ask them what's important for you. That's first. Second, you include them in research. You try to make it therapeutic research, right? So research can be therapeutical and research can be non-therapeutical. You try to optimize, to maximize therapeutical research. And once you finish the research, you don't just leave, right? And that happened a lot in cases of HIV research, that become very, very controversial. You either stay as a researcher, or at least you take care of the community by either providing them the benefits of the research for long term, or you provide them any resources or any benefits, even if they're not directly accrued by the research, you still provide some benefits long term.
Right. That reminds me of the Tuskegee experiments, when researchers were doing experiments on Black people, but it was not intended to help that community. It was used to help, the white population mainly, and the people who are being studied on, they don't know they're being studied. They don't get compensated at all. They are not even informed of their role in this experiment. So what you're saying is interesting, because we kind of, on the surface, looks like we're going back to, just doing experiments on populations that are suitable for experiment. But it's not really the case because it's the intention and the preparation work behind or before doing the research that is important. We talk to the community and see what they want. Maybe they actually want to contribute to the research, or maybe they're looking for, some benefit to themselves, or compensation could be possible. But what really matters is, you have to actually talk to the community instead of, asking them to participate in a research that they don't know what's going on and they don't actively consent to actually being studied on.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that brings to mind two things. One is first, absolutely. So Tuskegee, most of the time in bioethics, we learn about Tuskegee only as if, you researchers didn't inform the black people in Tuskegee, Alabama. But it was much more than that. It was much more malevolent than that. If you read their texts, their letters, their reports, they are showing a lot of racism,
right,
towards and superiority towards their subjects, right? So there are a lot of really serious issues with what happened in Tuskegee. What is happening now, at least ideally, is exactly what you said. It seems as if we are going back in time, but in fact, it is an ethical progress. Right now, we are engaging communities because we consider them as equal to us, persons with dignity, with respect, with autonomy, and we include them as part of justice, not as part of injustice, of the way we prejudice against them, and just hatred and this feeling of superiority over them. The reason why, and this brings me to the second point, and this allows me to talk about IRB, I guess the reason why I emphasize ideally is because we still, there are a lot of researchers out there. A lot of them are not trained in philosophy or in ethics and humanities in general. And the academic world is, as you can experience in Hong Kong, the academic world can be very demanding, even as a student. And there is a push there to produce, even sometimes it means neglecting what really matters, which is the dignity and benefits and well-being of your participants, of individuals. So, you can state in the declaration that, you should treat vulnerable populations with respect, and that's what the Helsinki Declaration does. But in real life, in practice, in the field, that won't be enough. Right. So exactly for that, you have the institutional review boards, and their goal is basically take the Helsinki Declaration and apply that to the field, right? Or rather, make sure that researchers apply that in the field. And that became these ethics review committees, by the way, they became so, or one way to show they became so important is that in several countries, so Israel, for instance, in IRBs are called Helsinki Declaration. And we have a national Helsinki Declaration or superior Helsinki Declaration, and we have local. So each academic institution or hospital has its own IRB.
Right. That's a great transition to our next topic. So my understanding of the declaration is more like guiding principles, general ideas of what we should do, but IRBs are the monitoring bodies that kind of make sure that each and every little research that's going on is being held to that level of, requirement and ethical standard. Do you think they are working? Do you think they are effective in doing
we
that?
talked about this before. So, look. Okay, so there are various ways to answer that question. One way as a researcher, another way as an ethicist, and another way as someone who, tries to be an expert on research ethics.
Have you ever been on an IRB panel before?
I never sat on an IRB. I was never part of a member of an IRB. I did sit on several meetings in the US and I think in Israel, but I was never a formal member of the IRB. So as a researcher, I will tell you it's extremely annoying to apply for an IRB.
I agree with you on that.
All right, so you applied at Harvard, right?
Yes,
How
did
was
it.
how was that?
Oh my! It's actually it's a lot of trouble. It took me, I did a master's degree for 1 year, and that application process alone took up the main bulk of that 1 year. So instead of, getting the approval and then starting on my project immediately, most of my ethical research experience was spent on applying for permission to do my ethics research. It is definitely a very interesting experience. You realize that a lot of bioethics in practice in the research world is paperwork, basically, and a lot of back and forth, talking to the people involved and waiting for a reply. It really isn't, you come in with a big ambition on, I want to do something that's, bioethics, and this is important work. Like, when I was learning about this concept in class, I was thinking that IRBs are great. It's, it really monitors you and makes sure that none of these horrible experiments would happen again. But in practice, it's just very bureaucratic. There is, a lot of paper forms that you have to fill in. I understand that it's trying to make sure that you adhere to certain, standards of practice. But, as a researcher myself, it's very annoying. And I don't really think it deters people from doing unethical stuff. It's more of a insurance on the monitoring body to feel like they've done something. They are carrying out the work of bioethics, but at the same time, most people, besides ethicists, most people who are involved in IRBs aren't really, attentive of ethics.
No, so absolutely. So that's my experience too. And I think a lot of researchers complain about the same things, and all books written about IRBs say the same thing, that it ends up being a very bureaucratic process. It takes a long time to revise and keep revising. And at the end of the day, you don't really understand. As a researcher, you don't really understand why they insist on all these peculiarities, right? And I can tell you, and so I applied for IRB in different countries. One time I applied for the same study, the same questionnaire in 3 different countries.
Yeah.
And I got different responses from each IRB, right?
It's interesting.
It is interesting and very frustrating, right? So, and exactly what you say, the feeling is that there's no really substantial engagement with the content. It's rather more about the paperwork, about how you write that or how you describe that, and if you include your name and email on the consent form, etc., etc. So it feels like it's missing the point. So that, as a researcher, is extremely, extremely frustrating and cumbersome, the entire process. So that's one answer. The second answer is, and it goes to what you said, as an ethicist, it's exactly so. A lot of the times you feel like the IRBs are not there to protect subjects or participants. They are there to protect institutions, right? They are there to protect from legal liability. They are there to make sure that, the institution can say, we have this process in place. We don't need to do anything else, right? The problem that creates is researchers think that instead of a necessary condition, they come to think of IRBs as a sufficient condition for research that is ethical, which means that once they know how to apply for an IRB because they do it a lot of times, and eventually, and this is another issue with IRBs, all research will be accepted, right? You could go to a private IRB, you can go to an institutional IRB, eventually it will get accepted. So researchers know how to do that, and what they end up doing is, I suspect, once they get the approval, that's it. So they do whatever they need to do in order to get the approval, but once that they got that, they don't care about the ethics of a study, and that's a concern. Another another issue is exactly what you said. A lot of folks sitting on this IRB, who sits on the IRBs, right? So you have a public representative, which is great. Most of the time, doesn't have background in ethics. It can be a community leader or a religious leader, but not a lot of training in ethics. You have a lot of attendings from different disciplines, right? Especially if it's a hospital, and they have no knowledge of ethics, no training, and oftentimes not a serious concern about ethics. And you are supposed to also have a legal representative, like a legal, so like a lawyer or someone with legal training, and they are supposed to monitor the research. A lot of the times they are the chairs actually of the committees. And again, not all of them, most of them don't have ethics training. According to the Helsinki Declaration, and according to a lot of, at least the institutions that I know, institutional policies, you are supposed to have periodic training, formal training for the IRBs. A lot of places don't, right? So they don't have basic training in bioethics, research ethics, and they don't get that, right, during their service. So one result, or this is one reason why you get a process that seems more bureaucratic than substantial. Having said all of that, from a more clear, I would say, philosophical, ethical, and really research ethics perspective, potentially there's a lot of you could see why the use of IRBs could be extremely, extremely powerful and beneficial, right? So even if you think that, as I do, that ethics is really something that exists, right, in real life, if you believe in moral realism, you still need to apply the Helsinki Declaration and other ethical principles in concrete cases, right, in real life. And that's the job of an IRB. You don't have enough bioethicists to do that, right? So in that case, the IRB has a significant role, and they can be extremely powerful if they manage to do their job appropriately. So they could guide, they could inform, and they could make sure that researchers act according to ethics that are reflected in the different declarations, different ethical codes, and the Helsinki Declaration.
I do have to agree with you on that. I think IRB has a certain, it at least guarantees that a research protocol is up to a minimal, extent of ethical compliance. When you're filling in those paperwork, you do have to tick those boxes, and you have to have those protections in place. So for example, if you sign your name under, I'm gonna put patients' data in an encrypted database, you have to do that. And that's what an IRB at least help you guarantee, that this basic level of ethical compliance is reached in a research protocol. And even as you said, every research protocol eventually gets accepted, but there would have to be modifications here and there. And those modifications I think they are important, and they are probably, good improvements to a protocol. So at least there's that. And yeah, not everyone is trained in ethics. Not every researcher is or should be. Not everyone should be trained in ethics. At least if every research protocol goes through an IRB, at least it's, reviewed under a certain requirement of ethics, that's still a good thing. It's better than not having an IRB. It's much better than not having an IRB. What we can do is maybe keep improving the role of an IRB and just raising awareness for even researchers that are not ethically trained to understand the significance of an IRB, which is not just something to, keep you from doing your research. It's not something that's there for the paperwork. It actually has purpose. And I feel like if everyone understands the meaning of an IRB, we'll be more receptive to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's exactly right. So there's a difference between, discarding the need for an IRB just because they don't function well. What you can do instead of that is say, oh yeah, IRBs are super important. We should keep them. We should just improve them. So that means, better training in bioethics, better training of the researchers in bioethics, so they know that they understand why IRBs are important. They really understand rather than just say they understand.
Right. I think it's great that you have clinical experience, you are a researcher, but you're also trained in bioethics. So that's a great, it's kind of a different perspective. You kind of see the importance of IRB, but you also see why they might not be sufficient in functioning.
Yeah, and yet again, I mean, even with all of that, I still get a lot frustrated after seeing the revisions of an IRB. Absolutely,
Yes.
but that's your future too.
Maybe
Right,
it
the
is.
researcher, clinician, and bioethicist. All right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.